Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 464. My name is Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast, a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on the network, please visit evergreenpodcasts.com. This week's interview is with my wonderful friend Adrian Swinscoe. Adrian's a speaker, multiple-time author, advisor, and renowned expert on customer experience. He's also been on my show 2 times before, a most rare occurrence. After Punk CX, he's now come out with Punk XL, where XL stands for Experience Leadership. It's a delightfully collaborative book. In this conversation with Adrian, we discuss what experience leadership means, the responsibility associated with freedom. What does authentic really mean? How to keep the voice of the customer present in your organization, and the importance of the employee experience. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com. And please do take a moment to drop in a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. Now for the show with Adrian Swinscoe. My chum, Adrian Swinscoe, a repeat offender. It's great to have you on my show again. Written another book, bloody hell, Adrian. So wanted to talk about your latest book, which has the wonderful Punk XL emblazoned on the front, written by you and a bunch of squirrels.
Yes, indeed.
You called it your secret squirrel project. So first of all, tell us what made you write this book, Punk XL, and how is it different from Punk CX?
So first of all, thank you. Good to see you. The short story behind kind of Punk XL is that so Punk CX was written it came out in 2019, and it was born out of my frustration with the customer experience space and how there was all this activity and investment and enthusiasm around it, and it had been for a number of years. But I was frustrated at the lack of significant improvement in outcomes. Like customer
There's a lot of
outcomes.
talk, but not a lot of action.
Exactly, right? And so the part of the hypothesis behind the book was that from a musical standpoint, progressive rock emerged in the 1970s. And whilst it was popular, it was also accused of being quite elaborate, self-indulgent, overly ornate, all those type of things. And punk music exploded out the back of it with its back to basics approach. Anybody can have a go at it, and so pick up some drumsticks and a guitar, write a tune, and see how you get on. And it struck me at the time that the experience space was starting to exhibit some of the same characteristics as progressive rock did in 1970s. That it's becoming almost like overly complicated, certified, codified, metric, benchmarked, all these different sort of things, and sort of in danger of losing sight of its true and real constituents, i.e. customers, and more interested in of itself. And that led me to think, well, if that's true, then what would a punk version look like, which gets back to basics, which is all about heart and emotion, and about kind of, delivering kind of like something that kind of moves people. And so that came out, and that landed, and it sort of found its own space, and it was just really different. I did it because I as I say, it was born out of frustration, and I always call it 2 things. One is I call it an art project. And so it's just there. It's like any musical kind of album. It's like you don't necessarily have to like all the tracks. You might, as long as you like maybe 1 or 2 sort of tracks on the album, because it's kind of like styled that way, sort of short and pithy tracks rather than chapters, then that's fine. But I also called it, because it was heavily visual. I called it a visual slap in the face for the customer experience space, because it was almost like an invite and a challenge to do better work. Now, that was in 2019. And for some people it was like, "Whoa," and then some people was like, "Wow, that's amazing." And then 2020 happened, and now we're sort of 2 years kind of into sort of a pandemic. And when 2020 happened, it was fascinating how it almost came of it. It became completely relevant. It's funny that just when the first lockdown started, a friend of mine wrote me an email. It said, "It's amazing to see how much punk CX is going on right now, where you take away all the kind of the stuff and you have to collapse things down to here are the things that are absolutely essential, absolutely necessary." And then I was also speaking to another guy who is the CEO of a SaaS, a pretty important SaaS company in this sort of space. And he is part of this CEO networking, senior tech leader sort of networking group. And he said, what's fascinating is one of those kind of guys turned around to him after we'd gone through the first couple of months of the pandemic. And he said, you know that thing that we said was important, i.e. customers? He says, now we realize they really are. And we're doing all the things that we said we should have been doing kind of now that we were talking about kind of last year. And so it just basically made everybody go kind of pay attention. And that was great. And so we saw some great kind of progress and we saw some kind of like big failures and all these different things, but we saw a lot of people trying stuff. But what was fascinating for me, having written that and then watching all these things that happened, is like over the last couple of years, and particularly over 2020, because I think it's settled and formed in 2021, is how almost the tectonic plates have shifted in terms of priorities and what's important and so on and so forth. And it struck me that it's become no longer sufficient to talk about customer experience in isolation anymore. And I remember writing a piece, and I think it was in July of 2020, and it struck me that one of the pieces I talked about these number of imperatives emerging from this pandemic, and I talked about one which was an experience one, and it talked about this idea that we're going through at a minimum a quadfurcation of the experience domain. It's a real word, by the way. I looked it up.
Quadraphonics, that reminds me of The Who.
Yeah, exactly. And it seemed to me that rather than just having, because what we normally saw is that this idea that people normally put customer experience here, employee experience here, and so on and so forth, it's all very quite separate. But actually, it felt like all those things were sort of merging together, and we end up with a bigger experience domain where you have a customer bit, you have an employee bit, you have a stakeholder kind of bit, you might have an ecosystem, which is like a bit, which is an extension of your employee supplier kind of bit. And then there's also this other bit, which is almost like the connected tissue of all these different things, which is the experience of the leader. Because many people were saying, well, as we respond to the pressures of the pandemic, people, managers, supervisors, leaders should look after their people. But we made some big assumptions that those leaders were capable of working in this new way. And evidence suggests that it put a lot of strain on them. And so what it showed is like, actually, we need to re-examine what it means to be a leader in this sort of space. So that was the first part. And then the second kind of like part of it is that whole stuff started to ruminate. I started to ruminate on that. It's like a slow cooker in my brain sometimes. I started to think about this thing, is that all these different sort of dimensions. And then I was starting to think about, well, surely the thing that we're trying to achieve here is, how do we lead from an experience perspective? How do we achieve that? Because we're quite comfortable talking about brand leadership. We're quite comfortable talking about market leadership. We're quite comfortable talking about technological leadership and so on and so forth, as well as kind of personal leadership. But I don't think that we've really started to talk about what experience leadership means, and what that means in terms of for the organization, for the people, for the culture, for how we do things, how we engage with our customers, and our impact on the broader world. And that's what Punk Excel was about, because the Excel stands for experience leadership. So it stands on the shoulders, if you like, of CX and says, I think there's a bigger game here. I think we need to start talking about it. I would think we need to start thinking about what it means from the individual, what it means to lead a team in an organization that delivers the outcomes that you aspire to. What is the culture and the employee experience that you need to kind of to enable that? How do you structure and organize a company to be able to deliver that? How do you engage with your customers? And then also kind of what happens beyond that in terms of your footprint on the world, as it were, and your society and neighborhoods and things. And so the book, and again, is just as you say, it's a collaborative effort. So I've had, it's like the second album, but a collaborative effort. I got second album jitters. And so I thought I'd de-risk the thing and find out if I was kind of mad or not by inviting a whole bunch of, if like, diverse voices and perspectives to try and enrich it. And they absolutely did. And I hope it's just a start of a conversation which says, what does this mean? And if you go, are we experienced leaders? And if not, what do we need to do in order to get there?
Well, when I was reading it very much the idea of experienced leadership led me to think really hard about culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where it has to begin at some level, your culture and the way you are with your employees, your stakeholders. But then it goes all the way out to the customers, to the footprint. So it becomes more than just culture. So I really did try to grapple with that, Adrian, as I was reading it. But I enjoyed it very much. And so one of the things I also think is worthy of note is that you've decided to make all the profits go to charity. Tell me about that process, because as an author, we don't make a lot of money. I certainly don't.
No.
But it's a very generous ambition. And so, which charity and why did you choose them?
So first of all, so writing the book, you're absolutely right. You don't kind of earn very much out of from book sales, not unless you're like a big name author and you sign a big kind of like deal and then you're selling millions and millions of copies.
It's not me.
No. But then working in a way where I had 12 contributors that contributed, I think somewhere in the region of about 17 tracks to the book, I was thinking about, well, how do I don't want to just kind of say thank you very much and then not do anything with it. And then I thought to myself, well, actually, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make an arbitrary decision. I'm going to fund it. I'm going to create it because I think it's worth creating. I hope the experience of contributing to it was valuable and enriching for the people that are involved in it. And my understanding is that it is. But I thought, well, given where we're at, and as an acknowledgement of the collaborative effort of it, I thought, we should just donate the proceeds of the book to charity. And I decided that the charity a charity that I know reasonably well is a charity called Médecins Sans Frontières, or for other people otherwise known as Doctors Without Borders. And I think they just felt very appropriate for the time that the book is coming out and what we've gone through, what many people are still going through, and what many people will continue to go through over the coming kind of months and maybe years. And I think they're just an incredible organization that go to some places that many parts of the world have forgotten about and don't get told about, to help people that are in distress. And so if we can contribute just a few quid, however it might be, however much it is, I think that was the right thing to do. And if people aren't familiar with them, that gives them a bit of visibility too.
Médecins Sans Frontières was certainly something I know a fair amount about with my old French background. And the interesting thing about the Médecins Sans Frontières, Without Borders, is that it does seem rather in the current of the day, which is this idea of globalization and the lack of borders that internet has made of the world. So kind of a funny congruency there. So what I liked about your book was this ability to sort of pick and choose as I went through it. I sometimes, I'll start at the back of a book, and that was kind of fun as well. And so I did it in a kind of hopscotch kind of way. But there were a bunch of tracks that I really enjoyed. And so I
Okay.
wanted to start with the first one, which kind of felt like a paradox to me.
Hmm.
And I explain why. I think of punk as a rebel.
Hmm.
And usually as a rebel, you're rebelling from something.
Hmm.
Yet you talk about this idea of freedom in the book.
Hmm.
And you write about and you say, freedom is responsibility, choice, and the free assumption of social obligations. It's about going from the freedom from to the freedom to do. Talk us through that, because I thought that was a really interesting space.
Excuse me. So if I'm not wrong, that's a track by Ari Weinsweg. And I should tell you about Ari a little bit. He's one of the contributors. And Ari runs, I should say that Ari and I are fellow philosophical anarchists, let's say. And I've had him on my podcast, and I think he and his co-founder, a gentleman by the name of Paul, I forget his last name, run what they call a community of businesses out, and they're generally food-related businesses out in Ann Arbor in Michigan. And I just think they've been voted some one of the coolest businesses in America and things by Inc. magazine and that sort of stuff. And it's just because of how they go about it. And so Ari is a wonderful soul, and he contributed that. And I admit some of he's a prolific writer. I can see some of the books that he's written up, and he writes books that are like this yay thick, right?
Inches.
Yeah, like, I mean, if you don't like it, it's going to be useful as a doorstop. I mean, they're kind of that kind of
Meaty.
yeah, they're kind of material. When I first read that track, I had to read it and reread it again. I mean, a bit like you say, like there's difference of like, there's freedom from, freedom to. And I was like, going, it's a really, really interesting point. This idea that your existence comes with the responsibility. And it's almost a bit, to me, this is what it means to me, is almost like being an active participant in the kind of the world comes with a responsibility. And sometimes it's not about what you're free from, but it's almost like what you choose to do. And I think that's the thing that people think about. It's like sometimes they think about freedom as from a constraints perspective rather than a directional perspective, and a choice in terms of this is how I choose to be. Like I choose to be honest. I try and choose to be open. I try and choose to be, no, I don't try. I choose to be generous. I choose to be kind. I choose to be curious. I choose to be all these different sort of things. That's not a freedom from thing. I have I'm free to make those choices, which allows me to define the direction kind of travel. And so that's what I think that means, which is, it's a really interesting distinction. And I had to reread it again because I was the producer, as it were, on those kind of like tracks. They got sent to me and I'm like going, what? And when I read it, and I sort of like played around with it a little bit, it makes a lot of sense. And actually, you know what? You talk about kind of like punks being kind of like rebels and stuff. But punks are also really thoughtful and sometimes thought provoking and show you things in ways that make you go, huh, okay. And sometimes that can be a surprise, because sometimes it's not thought of being thought of as being very sophisticated. It's from the street, as it were. but actually it's there to surprise you, because actually, if you think about punk as a broader sort of social kind of movement, it's one of the most enduring and powerful and most significant social kind of movements that's happened in the last 50 years. People you still go, think about punk, and people go, oh, I think I understand what that means.
So I wanted to juxtapose, or at least put that in context, because I had a lovely exchange with my friend Scott Shute, who used to be in charge of meditation at LinkedIn. And he wrote in a mail that he left LinkedIn. He said, the new life is fantastic. Geographic freedom, time freedom, financial freedom, all helps with the spiritual freedom, with a big smiley face. And often when we're working in business, the countervailing force that is not freedom full is the financial imperative, the financial, you had the commercial call that always brings it back down to making the quick buck.
Sure.
And so I was thinking about that in liberating us from that somehow anchoring point and giving us the freedom to do something important that will ultimately have to and does bring back financial profits as well.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, your story reminds me of another story that I heard about, and it's related to a guy who is, he's 55 years old, and he's from Cuba, but moved a number of years ago to Florida, I think South Florida, and he found himself kind of like working away, had his own little garage, his own like workshop, doing this all the different sort of thing. And what was interesting what you said, because he's actually moving, and I've never heard about this before. He's moving back to Cuba from Miami, because one, I don't want to get political kind of here. One, he got sick of the Cuban community kind of in Florida, but he also got sick of, this is like, you move to America, this idea of like freedom, as it were, in air quotes, that's actually what you're moving to is capitalism, in air quotes. He says, so you don't really have time to do anything because you're always hustling to kind of earn the money, you can do the thing and all this kind of like stuff. He says, I don't have time just to go fishing. And so he's almost kind of going back to Cuba because he wants a simpler life, where you can just go, I can just dial down and I can choose to go fishing and so on and so forth. And so I think the thing about the idea, when you talk about, I think it's about choice. Sometimes we get trapped in kind of into this idea of thinking what it is that we need and what we want and things. And I think we probably need way, way less than we actually kind of like have or want. And because we don't kind of make those distinctions and try and break those kind of bonds, then we get caught up in this need more money, need more money, need more money. And I think that becomes, that like relates back to kind of what Ari was saying, is the freedom from the constraints that other society and other people are putting on, and the freedom to choose, to define your own life and what is important to you and what's not important to you.
So many people ask me how I felt when George Floyd was killed. And as I sit across a table from a black man who's about to talk about how the murder of another black man felt, I don't think it really matters how I feel.
Hello, I'm Stephen Dorsey, host of Black and White from Evergreen Podcasts. We'll explore and explain how white advantage, bias, and outright discrimination continues to plague our society. Black and White is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, of course, this other chapters within, or tracks as you call them, within the book. One was by Lara Khoury.
Yeah,
and she's talking about the voice of a customer.
Mm-hmm.
That is one powerful letter she writes.
Oh.
Or where
I had to persuade her to, because she wrote that sort of thing, and she was struggling to write something. And I said, just write something, write from your heart. She wrote this thing. And I was like going, she was like, I'm not really sure. I said, I suggest we write it as a letter. We should top and tail it sort of thing. Because here's the thing, it's real, it's raw. It doesn't have to be right, but it's like, full volume. And you're absolutely right. It's like, whoa, you're like hair.
Exactly. Well, it's a very incisive message, and it does speak to the different voice of the customer. I feel like this idea that the customer is important is old news if it weren't for the fact that people aren't doing it. But what's different is, of course, not only does the customer have the opportunity to express his or herself online or wherever, what they're talking about isn't just shitty experiences, bad product. It could be also, hey, you're not a good company. You might have a good product, but you're not doing good for the world. And people are looking from, in terms of the voice, the tone, the message of the customer, outside of the invectives, is also about a deeper, more meaningful objective for your company.
And I think that's absolutely right. I think a lot of people, this rising idea, the thing I talk about, what I mentioned before, talk about the stakeholder experience. That's quite a broad umbrella, but it's there to try and almost like characterize this sort of like that your brand's impact on and contribution to environmental and social and community and kind of political and all these different all these different dimensions. Your contribution to those domains is, people look at that, and those things are starting to blend, come together. So it's not separate from some of the concerns your customers have, or some of the concerns your employee have. All these things are overlapping. And increasingly customers are reporting that some of these, these things matter. And what's fascinating is like with the pandemic and all the stuff that can happen is it highlighted those things and accelerated those things. Like people were exhorting companies to look after their people and look after their suppliers. But then you end up with all of many of the different sort of protests that took place, particularly around social injustice and kind of discrimination, in particularly kind of like the Black Lives Matter kind of movement that many people, and it was spread around the world, and many people took it it was a flag to gather under, to coalesce under, which speaks to kind of injustice, social injustice and discrimination. When people are pointing the finger at kind of brands going, yes, you need to do better on this, and across all these different sort of things. And then you layer in all of the environmental sort of stuff that starts to kind of happen as well. And look, I feel a little bit sorry for many of the senior leaders in brands that have to deal with this sort of stuff, because this is an increasingly complex sort of picture. And these are hard scales to balance and multi-dimensional scales to balance. It's a bit like playing, I don't know, or is it 3D chess that Sheldon and Leonard play in a Big Bang Theory, which I'm like, I don't understand how that works. But that is that complicated. So I do recognize this is a complicated thing, but this is, for me, this feels like this is the game now. This is how things have changed, and it's changed so fast that it's complicated. And that's why I'm trying to start that conversation, to help people, to encourage people to think more holistically about this is the game that we're playing, and to realize it's complicated, because the sooner you get started on this, then the more experience you're gonna gain, the more understanding you're gonna have. You're more kind of the better suited and better equipped you are going to be able to respond to this sort of stuff. Because trust me, I truly believe that none of this stuff is going away. It's going, it's keeping going. And so the rules of the game are changing. People will resist the change because there's vested interests that don't like all this sort of stuff, but the change is coming. And the quicker that you get onto this kind of like this train, as it were, or into this kind of road, into this kind of groove, and start to wrestle with it, customers will go on the journey with you. Your people will go on the journey with you, because people understand that this stuff is difficult and it takes time to get right. But if you have the right intent in your heart about what you want to do, I think people will just travel with you.
So I was thinking, as you spoke about that, about Squid Games, how it moves away from a game on a screen into, of course, still a fictional space, but real life. And so it makes me think of a corporate world, which previously was a sort of a 9 to 5 in an office thing, to being a 24/7, no boundaries, like the Médecins Sans Frontières thing, where it's all invasive, all in, everything counts. And so it leads me then to kind of, I think in that context, understand what authentic means, because it necessarily means we can't be perfect. Because by gum, even if we try to pretend 9 to 5 that we do everything right, we aren't perfect, and we can't possibly be perfect all the time to everybody everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I question the whole authenticity kind of thing in the book. Like, what does it really mean? Use the example as like, so if you're a jerk and you're consistently a jerk, are you not being authentic? Because authenticity and being authentic and from a dictionary perspective means being true to your genuine self. And then conversely, if you were trying to be kind and generous and insightful and empathetic and all these different sort of things, working from a base of being a jerk, but you're trying to be less of a jerk and more kind and empathetic and generous and all that sort of supportive and enabled and an enabler, et cetera, then technically you'd be unauthentic. And so that I struggle with these canned versions of stuff that people aspire to be. It's like hero leadership or transformational leadership and all these different things. I'm like, it's like, if you're true and honest with people and straightforward with people, then people are able to make a choice, right? And yeah, that's going to be problematic for people, and it'll be problematic for big companies that have that are quoted and have to deal with all sorts of kind of like legal and financial and risk related sort of like stuff. But I think it's still a problem that needs to be solved.
Well, I've had 2 recent guests on my show, both of whom were psychologists. Manfred Katz de Vries, a professor at INSEAD, he's written 60 books, and he probably would have a long-term route of clients because of the nature of the beast today. And I think, as you say, a lot of companies are going to be faced with the problem of actually, first of all, do leaders know who they are in the first place? And if they have this idea, to what extent it's actually related to who they truly are, and or related to the perception of them as leaders as they drive this experience leadership. There are 2 things, Adrian, I wanted to address before we close off. The first is, you talk about how importance varies with the survey that was done by Avas. the advertising agency, they did this X index, which covers several countries and shows how what's important changes or varies according to countries. And I was puzzled at some level how some countries believe in personalization more than others. One of the things it seems so deeply challenging for large organizations trying to get this X right is dealing with the cultural differences, which include, well, my privacy is more important than their privacy. My data in my country has different laws, and permissions here and there are different. And so when you're trying to create an experience and you're trying to maybe move towards personalization and make the people feel like they count, it's kind of a fuck fest.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think the reason I found the Havis's research really interesting, because anecdotally I'd heard lots of different kind of like stories about lots of different kind of things from around kind of the world, where it's like this. It's almost a bit like this thing. It's like I learned this new word called multivalent, which is where you can take something, and it's a bit like having doing that exercise with the kind of the multicolored beach ball, where you stand in the center of a room and it's got different colored kind of panels. And if you have a circle of people that stand around it, and you stand in the middle of the room and you ask each person to describe the beach ball, then they'll all give you different answers. And I think experience that what the Havis's study showed is that experience is quite a nuanced thing. Now, I think there are bases, there are basics, and there's foundations kind of in there. But it's almost a bit like, here's a reference, a music reference for you. It's a bit like having your graphic equalizer for different kind of countries, right? So it's like you get your base sound, so it's there, and understanding what that basics means for your brand and for your market and for your value proposition and all these different sort of things, that can give you a good place to start. And then you can start fiddling around and fine-tuning the proposition depending on the different markets. The challenge is, because I completely get what you're saying. It's like, it's a fuck fest. It's like the people are just, you get mind blown at the kind of the variety that you're presented with.
Yeah, the complexity.
Yeah, of course. But here's the trick. I actually don't think many brands have figured out what the basics are. So it's a bit like you're trying to build a big house, right? But they still haven't kind of figured out they need to build a big house on solid foundations. And actually, many of the big and the most successful brands around the world, it's like a secret that's hiding in plain sight. They do the basic stuff really well, and then that gives them permission gives them a reputation for reliability and credibility and trustworthiness and all that stuff, because they show up when they need to show up, and they solve the kind of problems, and then it allows it's an old idea about this, almost building an emotional bank account with their customers, because I already trust you, and therefore that allows you to kind of to go on a journey to build things on from there, and it gives you the greater wherewithal to be able to make mistakes because you've got credit in the bank, as it were. So the problem is that people are jumping forward when they actually should be kind of like starting and going, what are the basics? How do we do the basics? Kind of really, what do the basics mean for my brand, my positioning, my product, my service, kind of the market that we find ourselves in, and how can I deliver that consistently kind of well? Problem is, most of that stuff is not very sexy. And then you run in a counter you can start getting tripped up with some of the other dynamics that exist in organizations around people being interested in cycling through positions, and
or justifying the why I went to business school.
Yeah. There you go. And so it's all about like, I'm going to do something short term and I'll get promoted and I'll go on from here and so on and so forth. So they're not in it for the long haul their end to do something which is fancy and get attention and it's new and exciting, and that's the thing that they get promoted on.
Well, I mean, that does bring up another point, which is why am I working? And part of actualization is also achievement and feeling like I did something. And if it's but simple and it's just repetitive boredom every day, that also doesn't lead to a great employee experience. So you've got to find ways to jazz it up and make everyone feel like they're contributing and participating in something bigger. Because it's like the who's that? The JFK went to someone at the NASA and the janitor. So what are you doing? So I'm here. I'm making someone go to the moon.
Yeah.
That kind of feeling, attaching it to something bigger.
Yeah, you can take it in a very simple sense. Let's take a very like a service contact center sort of space, a very quite traditional sort of space. Most contact centers, even now, they're kind of shitty places to work. They're not kind of looked after, not well resourced, not people not well paid, not necessarily well trained in things. They suffer. Most contact centers will suffer on average somewhere between about, let's say, the number varies, but let's say it's about 50%, between 40 and 50% employee churn on an annual basis. Now, that's a wild figure if you just think, actually, you think about, I've got a row of 5 people, then they go, out of those 5 people, 2 of them are not going to be here next year. Minimum. And it's always a constant sort of thing. So it might be, and that has implications on quality of, service delivery, cost of training, kind of cost of hiring, all of the performance, all of that sort of like stuff. Imagine if you took it on as leader and you went, oh, and by the way, many of those people don't leave because, many of those people leave because they're just not getting the support and the training and everything and everything else that they want. Now, imagine if you can turn around and took it upon yourself to say, I want to make a difference. I'm going to make it my mission to half that number. From like in 2 years, whatever, I'm going to take it from 40% to 20%. And how much of a massive impact that's going to have on the business in terms of its cost base, its efficiency, its performance, and then the thing around, because you're going to have to do a whole bunch of stuff around employee experience and engagement and all these different sort of things. But then we forget the experience of the people that are working on the front line. It's like, imagine how many people you're going to be impacting, because people don't want to change jobs. People generally want to apply for a job, get a job, and then do a good job. And if you can half the number of people that are having to kind of like cycle out because they're like, this is rubbish, I'm out, before it kind of destroys me. And if you can make a difference in that way, then you're making a difference to people's lives, as well as to somebody's performance kind of metrics, as well as to somebody's balance sheet. For me, I think that's stuff of fucking rock stars.
Well, absolutely. I mean, of course, you have to start, if you're leading a company, you also need to bear in mind that basically 7 out of 10 employees are disengaged at work. Mm-hmm. So that's even worse, if you will, and of course the churn that comes with that, but it's the disaffection with work. And I think I would challenge most CEOs and ask them, where's the voice of the customer in the boardroom, in the decisions that are being made, and your customer service? How often do you interact with them? It certainly was obvious to me. And of course, I was fortunate that I had somebody who, working in customer service when I was working in Canada, who opened me up and allowed for us to have a relationship where I had the customer service head in my executive committee, relating all her experiences with her team and her team with the customers. It's amazing that people even consider outsourcing customer service. Adrian, I want to spend the last piece just talking about the future. You do have a piece about the future in the book, of course, but I wanted to look at XL, experience, leadership, and customer experience, in the context of what people are talking about today, which is that the future will be this meta future, a metaverse, that it will be Web3. So metaverse being this idea that rather than going on the web, that the web is around us and the internet is everywhere. And Web3 difference, just to give the definition, is more that supposedly everything's decentralized. We're moving again from centralization back to what the original idea of Web2 was, which is decentralized and a freer version.
Yeah,
so
okay.
if that's the future, let's say, do you agree? And then two, how does one attempt, if it's complicated and complex today, moving into that world and creating a better CX and a better experience leadership?
I mean, a really good question. I mean, I think that I don't necessarily believe it's the future. I believe it will play a part in the future. I think the way that it's getting pitched, it's like, ta-da! It's like, here's the new thing. Open this, kind of like, enter this new room. This is kind of like, there's going to be the everything, the all-encompassing everything. And I'm like, I'm not so sure. And for various kind of like reasons. One is that I think that also the last couple of years has also shown us, one, what we can do when we are forced to operate remotely and digitally. But it's also shown us what we really value and what we really miss when we have to operate remotely and digitally. So more of the digital might be okay for some, but probably not for everybody. And I think people have got this idea that like they really like the kind of yearning after the sort of the face-to-face,
the local, the human,
the human,
the hug,
the hug, and the handshake or the fist bump or whatever it might be, the kiss on the cheek. And so I think for many, I think more digital isn't necessarily the whole thing. I also have concerns about when I think about the kind of the decentralized nature of some of the technology, particularly how a lot of the stuff may actually be built on the blockchain or on blockchain networks. I have serious environmental concerns about the amount of power it takes, the amount of energy it takes to power this sort of stuff. I think it was a piece of, I saw a piece of research that said like the Bitcoin kind of market or the cryptocurrency kind of market on an annual basis uses the same amount of energy as the whole of Austria or something. Which
yeah, I know. I think it's Holland was the one I got,
right.
But the same idea.
Yeah, which is just like you go, what? And people kind of like think because you can't see it because it's digital and stuff, you don't necessarily see the environmental kind of impacts of it. But what's really clear is that these things have a cost to them. Now, I'm not saying that the technology is not interesting and not useful and everything else, but we have to, people way cleverer than me have to figure out a way that how can we make this type of interesting technology work more energy efficiently for it to really to be able to fit in a sustainable kind of mix. And when we do that, then I think we'll probably start to see the kind of the real potential of it. Because also kind of the other thing about it, kind of right now what we're talking about, we're in particularly in Europe, we're in this energy price crisis.
That's for sure.
Energy bills kind of spiking up. And if you're looking at that, becomes a cost that plugs into that, which then kind of pushes up the price of entry, as it were. And so I think there's all sorts of dimensions that I think that are that both human and behavioral and experiential that's going to mitigate kind of its adoption and impact and stuff. But I think there's also some technological and environmental and energy kind of related stuff that kind of that need to be figured out for it to be able to kind of progress. And I think it's interesting. I don't know enough about it, but I'm just thinking about the more kind of.
Yeah, my read on it, Adrian, is like you. I mean, who's to know? But the underlying principle of decentralization and the blockchain is, for me, a notion of trust. And what is obvious is that there's a lacking or a diminishment of trust in these big platforms. And I think in big institutions in general, a lack of trust has been an ongoing thought. But it would appear to me that this is a kind of movement against big tech, and is hopefully is sort of suggesting, well, we don't trust you. We'd like to have our trust elsewhere. Can the blockchain be the answer to it? Maybe in the absence of going through Web3 or something like that, the real question is, how do you instill greater trust amongst your employees and your stakeholders and create that great experience? So I'm going to call it quits, Adrian. But so how does someone get your book, something like Getting to... Wow! I was waiting for that one. Getting to Wow, your, of course, your Punk CX, and your latest book, Punk XL. What's the best way? How can people contribute otherwise to Médecins Sans Frontières?
So I would say that the Amazon is your best source for all of these books. I write in the inside cover of each of the Punk books that it's printed on demand by relentless.com. So fun fact, if people don't know who relentless.com is, then put it into your browser and you'll be surprised to see that it takes you to the Amazon homepage, which then tells you everything you need to know about Amazon. But their on-demand printing facilities I have been very impressed with, and their kind of global distribution, and therefore it's probably the least punk thing about kind of the Punk books, but it helps get the message out. So the short answer is go to Amazon and kind of you'll find the kind of books kind of there.
And the ways to get in touch with you, Adrian?
So the ways to get in touch with me are just Google me or Bing me or DuckDuckGo me or whichever your search engine of choice, and put my name in, Adrian Swinscoe. So that's ADriansWinscoe, and you will find me because there's only one of me.
And I concur that you are the best, Adrian.
Thank you.
All right,
so
brilliant.
much.
Thank you. Thanks for having listened to this episode of the Minter Dialogue podcast. If you like the show and would like to support me, please consider a donation on patreon.com/MinterDial. You can also subscribe on your favorite podcast service. And as ever, rating and reviews are the real currency for podcasts. You'll find the show notes with over 2,000 and more blog posts on minterdial.com. Check out my documentary film and 4 books, including my last one, You Lead, How Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free. Trust is the reason, still I won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man building an urge. I'm a convinced man to live and die submerged. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle with the complete. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free. Trust in my reason and let me show you why. I'm a convinced man practicing my lines. I'm a convinced man here in these confines. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, admit to the test. I'm a convinced man, I'm ready for an arrest. I'm a convinced man in the arms of a woman.
So many people ask me how I felt when George Floyd was killed. And as I sit across a table from a black man who's about to talk about how the murder of another black man felt, I don't think it really matters how I feel.
Hello, I'm Stephen Dorsey, host of Black and White from Evergreen Podcasts. We'll explore and explain how white advantage, bias, and outright discrimination continues to plague our society. Black and White is available wherever you listen to podcasts.